We're in 6th grade. Hopefully you got the quiz done. You're ready to take notes down here. You got the top working mixed numbers and impropers again in the mental math section done. Let's start with the problem solving, see how you did. Make sure you're paying the price doing this daily work on these power-ups. It's what's going to help build that base that we need all year long. Problem solving says this: what is the sum of the first 10 even numbers? So I listed your first 10 even numbers here. Now, what your book is going to suggest is try to quickly, as fast as you can, find a pattern to it. And so you could look for patterns that might add up to tens, which would be one way. What I did is I said 2 and 20 is 22, so is 4 and 18. So these are all 22s, and I have 5 pairs. So I take 22 times 5, and I get 110. That is a lot faster than adding 10 numbers together. So the encouragement is when the numbers are spaced evenly, instead of adding, you can multiply to get those. Okay, yesterday we were working with word problems on adding and subtracting. We didn't call them adding and subtracting, we called them combining and separating. Combining is an addition thought pattern, separating is a subtraction thought pattern, and depending on how it's set up, even though it's a combining, you might subtract to solve it, you might add to solve it. Sometimes with separating, it's the same thing. Sometimes you'll subtract, sometimes you'll add, depending on what number is missing. Today we're going to move on, we're going to get another example. So today we're talking about problems about comparing and elapsed times problems. Hopefully you have your yellow folder open. We got a blank to fill in. Let's get started on page 83. It said, problems about comparing often ask questions that contain the words like how much greater or how much less. The number that describes how much greater or how much less is called the difference. We find the difference by subtracting the lesser number from the greater number. The formula is greater minus lesser equals difference. Then they always give you letters G minus L equals D. Into your notes, guys, comparing problems are subtraction problems. Greater minus lesser equals difference. Hopefully you have difference memorized for subtraction, like sum, addition, product, multiplication, quotient, division. Keep those words going. Let's see what it looks like when we talk about problems with comparing. During the day, 1,320 employees work at the toy factory. At night, 897 employees work there. How many more employees work at the factory during the day than the night? So we're comparing those things. What they tell us, take the greater number, put it on top, take the lesser number, put it on the bottom, and you subtract those two. So I cross out the 2, make it a 10, make it a 1, 10 minus 7 is 3, cross it out, 2, 11 minus 9 is 2, cross it out, 12 minus 8 is 4, 423. It's a word problem. Don't forget your label. 423 workers. Awesome. Example number 2. Look how they word this thing. The number 620,000 is how much less than 1 million? The greater number needs to be on top, guys, so 1 million needs to go on top. Last time they say, hey, first number goes on top, second number goes on the bottom. You can't do that. That's not subtraction. It'll give you a negative number. So make sure you set that problem up correctly. 0, 0, 0, 0. Cross this out. 10 becomes a 9, it becomes a 10. 10 minus 2 is 8, 9 minus 6 is 3, 1, 2, 3, comma. There is 380,000 difference. Now guys, that one doesn't really need a label because we weren't working. It just said compare these two numbers. So boom, 380,000. Key with that one is make sure you have it set up right, because in the future, guys, we can't always go with it, because sometimes they'll say, hey, when we subtract this, you just get a negative number. We already know how to do negative numbers, so just make sure you're checking carefully to do those things. Turning the page, we get the next part of our lesson today. It's called elapsed time. Elapsed time is the length of time between 2 points in time. Here we use points on an array to illustrate elapsed time. Timelines are often used to indicate the sequence of important dates in history. The distance between two dates on a timeline indicates the elapsed time. So we already got timelines in history class. A person's age is an example of elapsed time. Your age is the time that has elapsed since you were born until this present amount. By subtracting the date you were born from today's date, you can find your age. So if I took today's date, which would be 2020, and subtracted from the year you were born, it would get your age. Now some of you might be doing that problem in your head and saying, Mr. Bauer, it didn't work. You might be off by a year because you haven't had your birthday yet in 2020. So if your birthday is still coming up in September, October, November, or December, you're not there yet, guys. So that's why that one might not work. But now, what I want to stress to you guys is today's date is called later. Last time when I say it happened later in history, we usually go farther backwards, like the 1600s were later in history. No, they're saying later is closer to the present. So just make sure you take the one that's closer to the present on top, the one that happened before that, earlier in history, and then it'll get your difference. Elapsed time problems are like comparison problems. We can solve them with a subtraction problem. Later minus earlier equals difference. Now let's practice it. It says how many years were there from 1492 to 1776? And then they tell you this in math class, unless otherwise specified years are always in AD, which is nice, because if you ever switch and subtract AD to BC, that's a headache, because you have to actually add the years together, but then you have to subtract one, because there's no such thing as the year 0. You don't ever have to worry about that, guys. They always give you years AD, unless they're going to say BC. So they're not going to put the label there anymore. They're just going to say, what's the difference between 1492 and 1776? Little history lesson, 1776. Good, we signed the Declaration of Independence. America becomes an independent country. 1492, Christopher Columbus, he sailed across the ocean blue. Good, hope you have that one in history too. Let's do the math problem. Here we go, 1776, the later one in history. 1492, the earlier one in history. I subtract, 4, can't do, cross out. 17 minus 9, 8, 6 minus 4, 2. There were 284 years from when Columbus got here to when we declared our independence from Great Britain after the Revolution, well, actually, to start the Revolutionary War. Example number 4 is another way we can do problems. It says Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was 34 years old in 1963 when he delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech. In what year was he born? Well, I knew he was 34 years old when he gave it. I knew he gave it in 63, so I need to subtract to figure out when he was born. 13 minus 4 is 9, 5 minus 3 is 2, 9 minus nothing is 9, 1 minus... He was born in 1929. Those of you who still love history, that guy was born at the start of the Great Depression, so his whole childhood was nothing but the Great Depression. From 29 to 39, we were in the Great Depression. Then World War II hit. His teenage years in the middle of World War II. What a guy, and the things that he lived through. And then obviously fighting for the civil rights until it cost him his life doing those things. But guys, date minus how old he is gives you when he was born. If they give us when he was born, how old he was, we would add those to get the date to when he gave the speech. So we'd be willing to be able to go both ways. Okay guys, lesson 12 today. Both patterns are subtraction problems. To get it figured out, if you look, all 4 problems we solved actually using subtraction. But in the future, you're going to switch that around and do addition sometimes, like I just said. They'll give you birth date, they'll tell you how many years later, and then when did that happen, you add those together. Hopefully you got those 4 problems done on the back side of your quiz. We'll get set to do some math problems.